everybody for having me here today for this really fascinating, I thought, set of presentations that talked about how we got to where we are. First, the history that Ari talked about, and then the geomorphic response, and then the ecological response to where we are. So what I'd like to do is talk about the context for that. Our management paradigms that also contribute to where we are. This is obviously a highly engineered system that we're talking about. And then what the future is likely to look like in this system, because the discussions that you'll all be having, sorry, I won't be here, but we'll be having for the next couple of days, are talking about how to manage this system by definition into the future. So talk a little bit about that, provide some context there. I think some of the things I've been saying like a broken record around this community for a number of years. I purposely used some slides that you might likely have seen before to bring those same points home. This is the context of how we're planning for the future in this basin. And I just wanted to say one other thing that's sitting there to Todd's talk, and I'm thinking back. Shout out to Paul Tashin, who's somewhere in this room, who was here back in the early 2000s for the Bosque Hydrology Group meetings. We talked extensively then about the Rio Poquito and how what we needed to do is the flows were declining at that time off of the high 80s and 90s that Todd talked about. How can we have all of the processes that we need for a river within that smaller platform? And so I'm feeling like we're re-enlivening those conversations today. Okay, so the first thing I would ask to add to this conversation are the current management objectives for this highly engineered system that is our river. And we're talking about the changes we've made to the river over time and the geomorphic responses, like what we keep hearing about, and then ecological responses. So what are we doing to engineer this river? Are we thinking about the geomorphology? Are we thinking about the vegetation? Like primarily our management objectives are for diversions for irrigation, municipal, and tribal uses, which are, of course, also irrigation is municipal. But we're managing for that. That's how we release the reasons that we release water from our reservoirs primarily. Then endangered species and other environmental compliance, not necessarily ecosystem needs, but the drivers of the environmental compliance for USA and other purposes, Clean Water Act, things like that. And then conveyance to Elephant Butte for delivery under the Rio Grande compact. So that's the management context. Oh, Paul's back now. He missed his shower. And we're managing this system, as we've been hearing about this morning, in a highly altered flow regime. So these images are from in the Rio Grande, which was a basis for what Ari was talking about this morning. But we're seeing already that Rio Poquito that I gave Paul the shout out for. So we're operating it already in a reduced flow regime. And this is where I showed Mike this presentation. He said, well, you are cheerful, aren't you? But, but we are seeing already dramatic increases in temperature in our basin. And that has huge implications for flows in our river. All of the changes that are underway are the context for this river that you're going to be making decisions for. And the river is the integrator of all of the things that happen in the watershed, and then even the global changes that are underway. So here we see for the 3 basin states, the changes since about 1980, late 70s to 1980, the change in the average basin temperature, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, they're pretty dramatic. Those are degrees Fahrenheit, from the low 40s up to upper 40s in Colorado, say in the low 50s to mid 50s in New Mexico, and low 60s to upper 60s. So these changes are significant. And in the Rio Grande Basin, what we're seeing is those changes in temperature are about twice what we're seeing globally. And the reason is that we don't have a lot of, normally, today's different, but normally a lot of moisture in our atmosphere. And so you can heat up drier air better than more easily with less energy than you can heat up moisture, because it takes a lot of energy to heat up water, right? So looking at that, particularly these changes in temperatures and their effects has led, this is just one example of recent literature, highlighting the Rio Grande as a real epicenter of aridification in the southwestern United States. As these authors, Mike Dedinger, Rad, they say the Rio Grande offers the best example of how climate change-induced flow decline might sink a major system into permanent drought. So we're absolutely talking about renewable peakoids in the future, and how to manage the processes of a river with less water in a smaller community. This is kind of interesting graph that I saw recently presented at the San Juan Chama Water Contractors Association. This is for the San Juan Chama project, and of course feed water to the Rio Grande system. And it presents the work that Jesse Roach, now from the Santa Fe Water Utility, and I did back a decade ago, creating the Upper Rio Grande Impact Assessment, which was the first major study of the changes in our water supply that we expect under climate change. So we took the full suite of projections available then, that's that blue envelope that you see here, and started trying to plan for, say, the median trace. We do things a little differently now, but that's what we did then. So that's the black line in the middle of the blue. And then the orange is what actually happened. So this is one of the ways, a number of authors have looked at this as well. We can kind of try to tease out how much of the changes that we've seen underway in the last 20 years are due to drought, the lower half of our hydrologic cycle, right? Constant trend, and then aridification, which is really the impacts of those increased temperatures that we're talking about. So here's how Jesse teased it out, the temperature being the difference between the full supply we used to get, that dashed blue line, and the median trace that we talked about, and then the lower part being the difference between that projected median trace and what we actually saw being the drought component. So what's clear is we have some of both, which means we're not, if this was all aridification, things would be worse right now than we're seeing. So that's a little bit of good news. Those increases in temperatures affect, of course, our entire watershed, and the river integrates all those changes. So the first thing, like kind of obviously, you have increasing temperatures, you decrease your ability to pile up snow in our headwaters. That's our primary storage mechanism. We think of reclamation as when we manages our water for water supply, but primarily we store it, or always have stored it up in the mountains. And this shows, because these are again older slides, but I'm just trying to reiterate things I've said in the past. Shows by the 2070s the change we're expecting from the 1990s in our snowpack, and sadly, there's an awful lot of red around here. That means sort of between, say, 80 and 100% decline in our snowpack. So that's where we can't store our water, which decreases our management capability. Now, the water does run down. We're not talking about major changes in our precipitation trend. Just the form of that precipitation and the temperature of the surroundings, right? So, which again has huge implications. But one thing that we see here, it's just a random pick of location, but we see more flows in our river systems in the winter time, increased flows in the winter time. But that's that snowpack running off. That's our storage no longer being stored. And then as we move through the system, everything that consumes water increases the amount of water that it takes. Demand for moistening up our soils, for our riparian vegetation, for our crops, for all of our outdoor water uses increase because of temperature, because of this what's called the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. And it shows that there's an exponential relationship between temperature and in the air and the amount of moisture that air can hold, right? So that's why we talk about relative humidity rather than absolute humidity, because we can hold a lot more moisture in the summertime than in the wintertime. And the places that we're talking about those temperatures changing up here or a place where that curve is pretty darn steep, right? So, a few degrees change in our average air temperature lead to a large increase in the amount of moisture that air can hold. Maybe some of you see me on New Mexico PDS talking about how that's why our hair dryers work. That's why our clothes dryers work. We increase the temperature, suck the moisture out of everything. And that's what's happening to our soils and the plants, causing implications throughout our system that, again, the river integrates. So here's one of the implications. We dry out the soils down in the valley, and then we get those New Mexican spring winds. And we saw some major implications of those earlier this year, but then here's one of them, and this is a place where we, like Mike and I were looking at some past hydrographs, and we're like, this year, looks like there was plenty of water, and then it just disappeared. Like, we can't understand where that went. Well, this may well be why you have those spring winds. If it blows across those dry soils, it can land on our mountains, and what melts snow isn't the background temperature, it's sunlight, right? And so if you shine on that dirt, then the water sublimates. It doesn't melt. We don't get to get it downstream. It sublimates, goes up into the atmosphere. You can see here that little pinnacle there. It's white on the top for whatever reason. It's not sublimating like all the dirty snow around it. So that makes a big difference into the degree to which the precipitation that falls in the mountains, even some that becomes snow, how much that could be carried downstream to the water supply for us to use downstream to manage our river and other uses that I was talking about. Groundwater, great, right? It's below ground, the sunlight doesn't hit it, the temperatures don't change like they do upstream. So that's where we should store our water, right? Yes, but there are some primary impacts of our changing climate, our increasing temperatures on groundwater, affecting the ability of moisture to get into the ground through dry soil and those sorts of things. But the secondary impact, which is greatly outweighing those changes, and this is something we've seen in New Mexico, and we're fighting about in court, and that is that when we run out of surface water supplies, become groundwater, right? And then that groundwater sucks out the water from the river, creating a cycle, right? So the more that we use it, the more in the future we decrease the flows that we have available. So it winds up being another one of the drains on the available water supply that we have to run through our river. So I talked about how we're losing our snow. We're also losing our forests and exposing the snow that we have up there to more sunlight earlier. That would be through things like beetle kill. Many of you probably remember the Jemez Mountains in Santa Fe area back in 2002, that terrible drought we had that year. We lost our beetle there. They haven't gone back. And also to wildfire. And here's the effects of Los Conchos fire in 2011, which had its implications for our basin. So Park Williams, who now is, I believe, at Lamont Doherty again, but he did his PhD work. His PhD work published in Nature Climate, which was a pretty cool achievement. He did it in the Jemez Mountains, and he was looking at the effect of that Clausius-Clapeyron relationship that I was talking about on trees, the trees that protect our snowpack. And what he found was that these same thing, these small changes in temperature lead to great changes in the vapor pressure deficit. So the difference between what the tree needs and how much moisture is actually in the air is going down the deficit. And if you look at that vapor pressure deficit, he graphed it up and he showed that the drought stress corresponds to the area killed by bark beetles and areas burned by wildfire when experiencing vapor pressure deficits in particular places, Jemez Mountains particularly. He also projected this into the future and said, if the climate models are correct, the average drought stress by the 2050s, that's not that far away, will match that of the worst drought years during the largest mega droughts in the last 5,000 years. We're talking about really profound changes in our uplands, and then we're starting to see that, unfortunately, but that will dramatically affect our ability to store water when it comes down, when we can manage it down in the valley, And it'll also cascade through other systems, and we've seen this. Post Quantus fire. We see monsoon flows come down and wipe out watersheds. Then there's fish kills, there's the ash coming into the river, there's debris flows, they clog the river system. There's an inability of our municipal systems to divert water for use by our human system. So these cascade through the system, and as we think about those changes, we need to think about those cascades of these changes to see how it affects the river. Okay, so another thing that could be good news. There's some evidence that summer monsoons could intensify as temperatures warm, because these decreasing temperatures are global. We get more moisture coming up off the ocean. It comes in during our monsoon seasons. These could intensify, and there's some evidence that suggests it might. But when we're talking about the river system, and we're talking about system where we're losing our forests to fire and beetle kill and things like that, there's also risk to our ability to convey water, to the structure of our river system, and also just generally increases in sedimentation that come from the monsoons, and that could increase flood rates that Mike was talking about earlier. Just important considerations for the changing dynamics of our system. Just summarizing some of the likely future scenarios that you'll be talking about managing in over the next couple of days is decreasing average annual flows, primarily due to increasing temperatures, but also more flow variability. We already have a very high variable hydrologic system, and we're talking about increasing that variability. So we'll have deeper droughts and larger floods, right? There'll be less flow predictability. Changes in flow timing, talked about higher winter flows, earlier and shorter peak years, no melt runoffs, and more summer river drying. Increasing size and intensity of wildfire, loss of upland forest to wildfire and insect infestations, and operatively for these discussions, increasing sediment supplies from the river. Those could include debris flows, but also just as we lose the vegetation off our hill slopes, just more sediment going down into the river that needs to be managed and moved along by a decrease in supply. And decreasing groundwater levels. As groundwater is used from surface waters in short supply, we have an increasing loss of river flows to the aquifer below, and that then feeds back into increasing our water conveyance challenges. And increasing challenges we will experience in meeting the needs of the listed endangered species, because for reasons I don't need to explain to anybody. Okay, so the key takeaways for the river corridor, again, the integrator of all of these changes. The future of the Middle Rio Grande will have lower flows most of the time, and lose more water to the aquifer below, so then they get even lower. These lower flows will be laden with more sediment, right? And these conditions will likely lead to riverbed aggravation. Lower average flows will lead to decreases in channel width, primarily through vegetation encroachment. That's why we're here. We're seeing that happen, both by native and non-native species, as Todd pointed out. We haven't really talked about this, but you know, it's clear that the existing cottonwood gallery from 1941 is at the end of its life. So we're losing that, and what we're talking about is what the processes that we're going to have in the future work. Extreme precipitation events will increase in magnitude, which will create occasionally high flows in a river that's going to convey them less efficiently. And wildfires pose a risk of debris flows, which could block the river and accelerate watershed erosion and greatly increase river sedimentation. So overall, these things all add up to a river with less water and more sediment that you are all going to spend a few days figuring out how to manage. Just a cautionary tale I'll put here at the end of my talk. This is a picture of the Forgotten Reach, which is downstream of Hudson County, Texas. You've got the Rio Grande Drive for about 150 miles, has clean water in decades. And what you get is a whole lot of here, primarily non-native vegetation filling up your channel. We also see another example we've talked about a lot here is in the Rio Chama below Abiquiu, where there's a lot of sediment coming in. So then a sign for what might happen in the larger system in the future. And there's been a lot of pressure from the local executive community for the Corps of Engineers to decrease the water that they release from Avenue Reservoir, and it's not moving that sediment along. So you're starting to see there the kinds of challenges that you would experience with those decreasing flows. And then right here is what happens when you have those flows fall. So these are the challenges that we leave you with for your discussions over the next couple of days. No, not small challenges at all, but again, I really appreciate what we've seen today to provide context for those discussions. I'm sorry I'm off to the San Juan with some reclamation management and won't be able to join you, but I look forward to hearing what's discussed. Thanks.
Thank you.